All right, chapter 21, section 3, the rights of women and minorities. You have, again, with the progressive movement, you have a lot of advances for the rights of women and some minorities. Women fight for temperance, which is the getting rid of alcohol sales, and for their right to vote. Obviously, their right to vote becomes a big major issue in the early 1900s. African Americans also challenge discrimination. They call for equality, and progressive reforms failed to benefit most minorities. So, new educational opportunities draw a lot of more women into the progressive movement. In 1870, only about 20% of college students were women. By 1910, that number had doubled, but they were denied access to professions like law and medicine and engineering. So a lot of women enter fields as social workers and social justice warriors, I guess, and then in the field of education. So they form these women's clubs and they campaign for a lot of things: temperance, women's suffrage, child welfare, political reform. They really go after temperance. They blame alcohol for a lot of the social problems, including family violence, criminal behavior. They said, well, guys wouldn't beat their wives and their kids and commit crimes if they weren't drunk all the time, right? And so they really set their sights in on temperance. The Women's Christian Temperance Union campaigned to restrict the sale of alcoholic beverages. Frances Willard was one of those. She opened over 10,000 branches nationwide and forced over 1,000 bars to close. Carrie Nation, another leader of this movement, would actually go into saloons and smash bottles at the bar with an axe in an effort to close down those bars. But it all came to a head at the 18th Amendment, where it banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, which then gives rise to a whole new problem called organized crime. Because people are going to drink. They don't want the government telling them what they can do. So you end up with a situation where you end up with more crime. You made things that people are going to do a crime. They also fight for suffrage or the right to vote. A lot of people oppose this. Political bosses really thought maybe that women would cause anti-corruption efforts to go through. So they really tried to restrict that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they found the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And in 1890, women actually win the right to vote in Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah. Women like Carrie Chapman Catt mobilize over 1 million volunteers when she takes over the organization and says that women will stop at nothing less than Alice Paul then goes and creates a more radical National Women's Party, and they use parades and public demonstrations and picketing and hunger strikes to spread their message about women's suffrage, even organizing in front of the White House and having a lot of their members getting arrested. Suffragists win the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, and it is ratified the next year in 1920, making it permanent law. On the African American side, you have people like Booker T. Washington, who encouraged African Americans to improve their educational economic well-being. He was born into slavery, but then he decided that he was going to become a very well-respected educator and lead through education. And he said that ultimately, if Black Americans would educate themselves, this would allow them to move up in society. And ultimately, in discrimination. You also have Ida B. Wells, who spoke out against discrimination and drew a lot of attention to the lynching of African Americans that was taking place. In her Memphis newspaper, Free Speech, she actually told the stories of over 3,000 confirmed lynching victims in the South between 1885 and 1915. But that's not without danger. Obviously, a lot of people in the South didn't like attention being brought to that, and she was forced to actually move to the North because of death threats. Then you have W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded a organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. They fight for economic and educational equality for African Americans. He himself had earned a doctorate from Harvard, and he believed that you can't just educate yourself, you also have to educate and protest unjust treatment and demand equal rights. So the NAACP wins major cases, one being Geen versus the United States, which outlawed grandfather laws. Grandfather law said that if your grandfather didn't vote in the last election, you don't get to vote in this one. Well, most black people's grandfathers had been slaves and weren't allowed to vote. So basically, it outlawed black people from voting. The Supreme Court says, no, that's not legal. And they struck a major blow to discrimination in that sense. Then you have the National Urban League in 1911, which helped African Americans move from the South to help find jobs and housing. A lot of groups get left out of the progressive movement. They did try to help them, like the Society of American Indians. They wanted Native Americans to adopt the ways of white society, but many of them resisted. They didn't want to just give up their own culture. They wanted to keep their culture and still be considered part of society, and white society wasn't all about that. So it remained a struggle. A lot of immigrant groups from Northern European countries also formed their own groups to help support their members. One of those was the Chinese Americans. They supported their members, including neighborhoods, district associations, cultural groups, churches, temples. They built the San Francisco Chinese Hospital in 1925. And although Chinese immigration had dropped, due in part to a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and riots, immigration from Mexico increased. And those Mexican immigrants began finding work in mining and railroad, but particularly in farming. The progressive reforms did very, very little to improve working condition for farm workers, though. Out there in the rural areas, they were focused more on the inner cities, not so much on the rural areas. And so they got left behind for quite some time on reform. And that ends section 3.